Monday, the 8th of March, 1965, and 3,500 Marines land on the beaches of Da Nang, the first American combat troops to set foot in Vietnam. By the end of the year, they would be joined by another 200,000 more. The battalion came ashore in full view for the world's press and cameramen to capture the historic moment Hollywood style. But their unseen enemy was watching too, and it quickly began its relentless attacks on American and South Vietnamese bases and supply routes as they spread across the country. They had come to Vietnam to win Uncle Sam's war. They had come prepared to stand up and fight. They had not come expecting this. They had been trained in Texas and Virginia, Florida and California, but it had not been like this. This was not the kind of war they'd come 9,000 miles for. They were infantrymen, ready to fight set-piece battles behind their tanks and artillery. This, they had been told, was to be a war of attrition, the kind of war they fought best the way it was in Korea, the only way they knew. They were not to know it then, but it wasn't the way of their enemy, the communist guerrillas, the Viet Cong. This war in Vietnam was going to be fought on their terms and where they chose to fight it. The Americans should have read their history books. They should have learnt from the French. "11 years before, in May 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, the French suffered the only defeat in their Indochina Empire. After a last desperate paradrop at the end of a 2-month siege, they surrendered to an army they had trained in a country they had created and given a name, Vietnam. In their capital, Hanoi, the Vietnamese celebrated independence with the man who had made it possible, Ho Chi Minh, fervent nationalist, dedicated Marxist. He was not to know it that day, but there was to be no peace in victory. The last soldier had not died. This was not the end. This was just the beginning. Ahead was another 20 years of fighting and another 1 million deaths in a 10,000-day war against the richest, strongest country the world has ever known.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
President John F. Kennedy, remembering Korea, was determined Vietnam should not go communist, a commitment he passed on to those who succeeded him, Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard M. Nixon. If Vietnam fell to Russian or Chinese domination, he argued, so would neighboring Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and the rest of Southeast Asia. It was called the domino theory. Vietnam, like Korea, was now two countries, partitioned at the 17th parallel, separating communist north from non-communist south. Immediately, the communists began secretly moving supplies into the south, stockpiling arms, ammunition, and food, in preparation for the war that everyone knew was coming. And with them came thousands of guerrillas, the ingenious and dedicated Viet Cong. Defeating them was about to become an American crusade. By the end of 1967, 2.5 years after the Da Nang landing, the Americans had turned South Vietnam into a vast military camp. Their forces had been increased to more than 500,000 men, and still they were arriving. The war was now costing a staggering $2.5 billion a month. But where was the victory after so much fighting and so much spent? Why couldn't the world's most powerful war machine defeat a guerrilla army a fraction of its size? What had happened to the generals' promises of a short, sharp war? So the generals began to persuade themselves they were winning by simply adding up and often doubling the daily number of Viet Cong dead. The body count became an essential part of the language of war and a vital statistic in the propaganda battle. How else could the Americans measure victory against such an enemy?
There were at least 2 people in this particular bunker.
Yeah.
And we tried to get them to come out using our interpreters and got no reaction. Thought they might have been dead because we had thrown grenades and stuff in there. Finally had an American trooper go in and was shot. As a matter of fact, I heard this morning that he did die trying to get them out. We then started throwing in the high explosive grenades and this sort of thing. Again, thinking we had them dead, started to dig them out. And about 10 o'clock last night, 2 of them came out throwing grenades and firing weapons. And of course,
all that,
after any human being you'd think had been killed, but the bunker was deeper and had more levels to it than we thought.
Charlie, as the Americans now called the Viet Cong, was rarely seen alive. And when they were captured, the Americans turned a blind eye to the tortures the South Vietnamese interrogators used to extract information. America's own body count was now more than 160 a week, over 8,000 a year, with 5 times as many wounded and maimed. If they still had no clear idea what winning meant, they knew what they were losing.
On Sunday, no more putting in for leave. Come
This is dust off 163. I have a good copy. We'll be leaving Coochie at this time for the mission.
The lifesavers were the medivacs, the medical evacuation helicopters. More and more, Vietnam had become a helicopter war, with no front line and the fighting spread right across the country. Never before in any war had helicopters dominated the action as troop carriers, gunships, scouts, and the medivacs.
1-4 Golf, this is dust off 163. I'd like your tactical situation and route of approach in your area, please. We're over your area at this time.
Been receiving contact to our east, over.
Roger, understand. The contact is to the village to the east. Okay, we'll be coming in from the west behind your tracks. Okay, going down.
Helicopters took you to the war, helicopters helped you fight it, helicopters brought you back again, one way or another. The American military command claimed that no wounded man, wherever he was fighting, was ever more than 30 minutes flying time from medical attention. It was the one war statistic men wanted to believe. The other was that without the medivacs, twice as many wounded would die.
Okay, good buddy. What's your last name?
Asbroth.
Spell it.
A-S-B-R-O-T-H.
First name?
Stephen. S-T-E-V.
Rank?
Sergeant.
Soldiers killing and soldiers being killed. But still no one doubted that the war would be won.
I'm feeling joy and grizzly bear, so like a flying to the air. Where to in my arms, you bet beware. I go instant cause they gave me a turn.
Dolly birds, nightclubs, business as usual in the cities. And who dared believe that the war would ever reach them? Saigon did, as it had always done, make money, pretending there was no war to be won or lost. The Americans had turned South Vietnam into a vast military zone, but in the cities they were content to believe their own propaganda that they were winning and they were safe. The war had even brought new woe, and Saigon went dollar crazy competing for the GI's time and money. But beneath the glitter, the Viet Cong had already infiltrated and were about to bring the war to Saigon's doorstep.
And now this war is moving into the cities. In the past few months, there have been 3 terrorist bomb attacks in Saigon, and in the last one, 42 people were killed. And now everyone's asking himself, when is the next one going to be?
The next one was Saigon. The Viet Cong attacked it on the 30th of January 1968, just as the Vietnamese were about to celebrate Tet, their Lunar New Year. The Americans and South Vietnamese army were caught completely unprepared. And across the country, the Viet Cong attacked them in 30 provincial capitals. In Saigon, the Americans fought to recover their own embassy when the Viet Cong, kamikaze style, attacked the nerve center of America's Vietnam operation. The suicide squad killed the guards and held the embassy siege. The Tet offensive was underway, and within minutes, Associated Press news agency telexed the story to the world. The capture of a Viet Cong prisoner by a Saigon police chief that day gave the world a new and indelible image of the war's brutality. Of all the battles to defeat the Viet Cong in their New Year offensive, the battle for Hue, the ancient imperial capital, was the longest and the bloodiest. The city was just below the no man's land that separated north and south. The communists had stormed it by surprise and had taken it in one night. It was to take the Marines nearly a month to get it back in some of the fiercest ground fighting of the war. They fought around the city walls non-stop for 24 days and nights. They lost men as they advanced. They lost more as the communist bombardment turned them around and forced them back again. Among the brave were the television cameramen who filmed the wins and the losses. On the 24th day, the communists withdrew from Hue just as suddenly as they had invaded. The fighting was over, and the Marines had taken the worst of it. They had suffered the highest casualties of any single action of the war. And when the dead were counted across the country, the Tet Offensive had cost the Americans nearly 4,000 men, the South Vietnamese 5,000, and the Communists nearly 60,000. The devastation of the once beautiful imperial Hue was almost complete. Only the Americans' decision not to shell the ancient palaces and pagodas saved them. The rest of the city was rubble.
When the French were here, they used to call the road that runs from Hue northwards towards Hanoi the street without joy. Well, the city of Hue itself has now become a city without joy.
It took much longer to count the civilian dead. They found 3,000 bodies in Hue alone. They were the victims of the communists' occupation, buried in mass graves. They had been shot, clubbed to death, or buried alive. It was the worst political slaughter of the war. And there were frequent horrific reminders of the atrocities committed by both sides. American search and destroy operations were often brutal and indiscriminate, burning down entire villages to deny the Viet Cong food and shelter, whatever the suffering. Destroying to save entered the Americans' war vocabulary.
Right here, there's a crack in the ground. Bamboo.
One platoon cold-bloodedly gunned down hundreds of women and children in a village called My Lai. The Tet Offensive had failed. The Viet Cong were never again a fighting force. They had lost the battle and 80,000 men, but they had scored a vital victory abroad. With their bodies was buried the American Army's credibility. A 500,000 soldiers and 3 years of fighting, and still they could not win the war, could not end it. The strategy of attrition, send more troops, send more firepower, was bankrupt.
2,689 soldiers.
The combat GIs knew it too. What their commanders were claiming no longer matched what they were seeing and hearing for themselves. Their victories were too hollow, and the cost of them now far too high. The mighty American war machine was bogged down with nowhere to go.
You're 18 years old and you're wearing somebody's brains around on your shirt because they got their heads blown off right next to you. And that's not supposed to affect you. I can never understand that. What would scare me is if we were to send a group of 18-year-olds 12,000 miles away and subject them to a year of that obscenity and have them not be affected. That's what would frighten me.
Khe Sanh was such a place bogged down. It was a camp under siege, 6,000 Marines with no way out except by air or a white flag. It was America's own Dien Bien Phu. It was resupplied in the same way. The generals had promised their president they would defend it, however long it took, whatever the price, whatever the casualties. For more than 2 months, the Marines were shelled and mortared most days and nights, and they wondered why. Everyone knew the base was no use to them anymore, but television had made it a symbol of America's true grit, and it became President Johnson's obsession. Then the communists pulled out, and the siege was finally over. And despite the months of famous fighting and dying, the American generals abruptly abandoned the base on April Fool's Day. Shortly afterwards, the communists moved in unopposed and stayed. Khe Sanh had cost many American lives. It had begun as a folly. It ended as a tragedy.
None of them received the hero's welcome. None of them received the hero's welcome.
None of them. None of them.
None of them.
America's anger over Tet gave way to frustration over Khe Sanh, then futility, and finally despair. People took to America's streets to show it. They demanded that their president should negotiate an end to the war, and the protests grew. They grew worldwide and were often violent. The generation gap was stretched to breaking point as Ho 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 Chi Minh became the universal chant of the young.
Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, ain't no left is gonna win. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, ain't no left is gonna win. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, ain't no left is gonna win. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, ain't no left is gonna win. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, ain't no left is gonna win. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, ain't no left is gonna win.
Jane Fonda took her protest and support to North Vietnam. It was a propaganda coup for Hanoi, and she became the idol of the peace movement.
I shed many tears in Vietnam. I cried every day in Vietnam. It was never for the Vietnamese. I didn't cry for the Vietnamese. I cried for the Americans. Because although the bombs are falling on Vietnam, it's an American tragedy.
The war protesters soon found their martyrs. National Guardsmen opened fire on an anti-war rally at Kent State University, Ohio. 4 students were shot dead.
Went out to fight for peace, for liberty and all. Went out to fight for equality. Oh, let's go. And the war
Suddenly, America halted its bombing against the North. For 3 years, the giant B-52s of the US 7th Air Force, flying from bases in Guam and Thailand, had been bombing North Vietnam back to the Stone Age. They each dropped their 60 tons of high explosives in carpet bombing north and south of the 17th parallel, attacking roads and bridges to stop the communists moving south. But despite the tonnage, the infiltration increased. The main communist supply route, north-south, was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Carved through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia, they could not have fought without it. All the Americans had to do was destroy it, and they would have won the war. But they could not. The B-52s had failed, so the American Air Force tried their close attack fighter bombers and their laser-guided bombs to knock out bridges and fuel dumps. The lasers were infallible, the pilots never missed their targets, but still the communists came. So they saturated the trail using transport planes with multiple machine guns that fired thousands of rounds a minute. But the communists' migration south could not be stopped. And under the cover of the dense forests, troops journeyed on at the rate of 100,000 men with 100,000 tons of armor and war supplies a year. To deny them that cover, the Americans simply took the forests away. They sprayed them with a defoliant code named Agent Orange. They used 20 million gallons of it to turn the jungle below into a wasteland, into a moonscape, to destroy the communists' invisibility and expose them to the all-seeing attacking helicopters.
They've drawn far from a little village about 2.5 miles in from the seashore and just into Quang Tri province across the Mechart River. The Loaches have drawn the far and now the Cobras are going in. But it seems that the North Vietnamese have got a 37mm anti-aircraft gun, firing airbursts, shrapnel exploding in the air, extremely dangerous with these very vulnerable helicopters.
The Loaches and Chinooks, the Hueys and the Cobras, they were the eyes, the ears, the transporters, the killers, and the lifesavers of the American war operation. Their air cavalry pilots considered themselves the elite of all the combat troops in Vietnam, and risk was the name of their game.
It's exciting. It's something that you've trained to do for an extended period of time. And you find that when you do it, initially going out on a mission, of course, you feel the same fear that anybody else feels when they realize that you might go out and get hit.
It's sometimes said that your unit is the only one that's still enjoying this war.
I wouldn't say enjoying it. I'll say perhaps participating. Some people enjoy it, some don't. Some just go out and do it as a job. It's a daily grind.
What is it to you?
I enjoy it.
March '68, and President Johnson is beaten. America tells him to get out of the war, but he prefers to leave that to another president.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
And Richard Nixon is waiting, and his campaign commercial ready for the television networks.
Never has so much military, economic, and diplomatic power been used so ineffectively as in Vietnam. If after all of this time and all of this sacrifice and all of this support, there is still no end in sight, then I say the time has come for the American people to turn to new leadership, not tied to the policies and mistakes of the past. I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
President Nixon was as good as his campaign pledges and promptly began to reduce the number of troops in Vietnam. He also looked for a new way to force the communists to negotiate a peace. And by Christmas, he had decided on his final solution. On the 26th of December 1972, Hanoi was bombed for the first time. Nixon ordered his Air Force to drop over 100,000 bombs. It was called the Boxing Day Blitz, and it lasted 11 days and 11 nights. In those 11 days and nights, nearly 2,000 people were killed. The Americans called it the most successful air bombardment ever. And that in a war in which they had dropped over 7 million tons of bombs. That's 3 times more than all that was dropped in the Second World War. The Boxing Day Blitz did the trick. The Americans got their peace without further communist dawdling, and they were soon on their way out. On the 15th of January 1973, military operations against North Vietnam ceased, and by the end of March, the last GI was on his way home. It was goodbye, Vietnam. At Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, American prisoners of war released by Hanoi shook American hands. For some, it was the first time in 7 years.
We are profoundly grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to our nation for this day. God bless America. God bless America.
Most of them were air crews captured after bailing out. They nicknamed their prison the Hanoi Hilton and were humbled in communist propaganda films like this.
Richard Eugene Smith, Major of the United States Air Force, born in Mississippi, was shot down over Hanoi. Marine pilot James Bond Stockdale of Illinois was downed over Thanh Hoa.
But now it was all over. The GIs were at last coming home. With the Americans safely gone, the communists tore up the peace plan, and with the South Vietnamese army reeling, got ready for the final offensive. This was the beginning of the end. And no matter how fiercely the South Vietnamese fought, more of their country was being swallowed up. So soon into the ceasefire, but how much longer could they and their President Chu survive?
Well, it's now 9:30, South Vietnamese time, exactly 90 minutes after the ceasefire. It's a strange way to begin the peace, but it seems that the South Vietnamese are determined to get back today what their generals lost yesterday. This is a vital road to President Chu. Without Highway 1 to Cambodia, without his capital, province capital of Tay Ninh, much of the war in the south is as good as lost.
There was chaos on the ground and in the air. A South Vietnamese pilot dropped napalm on a village northwest of Saigon, believing Viet Cong were hiding there. Instead, children came running out, among them a little girl of 9, numbed with shock, with napalm melting the skin on her back. An ITN camera crew tried to cool her with water. It was one of the horrifying, lasting images of the war. By March 1975, the South Vietnamese army had abandoned the northern provinces and had retreated slowly south, fighting a furious rearguard action all the way. And the communists came after them with enough men and supplies to last them a year of prolonged intensive combat. But they were to need only enough for another month. Finally, the South Vietnamese battalions grouped around their last remaining city, their capital Saigon, and prepared for the last major battle of the war. As the troops retreated south, people fled after them, refugees filling the roads, more than 1.5 million of them on the move. It was an exodus that stretched sometimes 20 miles long. People in panic, making for any port, praying for any vessel to take them south, where they thought they might be safe for a while. They congregated at Da Nang, where 10 years before the Americans had come with promises to save them. And there they fought each other to get on the ships, giving their children to strangers if it would save them, preferring they faced the dangers of the South China Sea to the enemy at their heels. Then Da Nang fell and they filled the ships to Cam Ranh Bay. At Vung Tau, the only seaport left, they fought with soldiers to get on board. Troops who had abandoned their posts and would soon throw off their uniforms as well. But the ships did not leave Vung Tau. There was no port open to them anymore. Nor did the soldiers or the refugees leave, for there was nowhere for them to go with the road to Saigon cut. So there they stayed and waited, abandoned by the government that had abandoned the provinces they once lived in. After months on the move, they had run out of places to run to.
We have been filming scenes like this, scenes of wretchedness and scenes of panic, all the way down the South Vietnamese coast over this past fortnight, starting with Da Nang and then Quy Nhon
and then Nha Trang, and a few days ago, Cam Ranh Bay. But for these boats and for these people, this is the end of their journey, because this is the only seaport left now in South Vietnamese hands. But if Vung Tau falls, and the communists are only 40 miles away now, for these boats and for these hundreds of thousands of refugees, at least for them, it will be the end of the running and the end of the war.
Saigon was now encircled, and South Vietnamese troops could not move out more than 10 miles along any road. Beyond that, the communists were waiting. Outside the American embassy, the wise, the wealthy, and those with any known American connection had been queuing night and day, demanding, pleading for a visa and a ticket for a seat on the United States evacuation planes flying out of Ton Son Nhut Airport. Then on the morning of the 29th of April, North Vietnamese artillery began shelling the airport, and their forward commando units attacked the city's outer defenses. Newport Bridge, spanning the Saigon River on Highway 1, was the last the communists had to cross to enter the capital. We didn't know it then, but this was the last fight.
There's no way of shifting these people. 500 or 600 troops on this bridge, fighting probably a dozen or so, maybe 20 at the most, communists, and yet there they are, they've been there all today. For one moment they panicked, and rightly so. The mortar hit right in the middle of them down on the right, 100 yards away. It's killed a lot of people. But now they've gone back to some of their positions. They've left one wounded in the road. Let's see the wounded. Got this, and dead on the right.
They held the bridge a few more hours, but everyone knew this was the end. Saigon was about to fall. Soon the war would be over. As they pulled back, they brought with them a wounded Viet Cong, a young woman commando they had been fighting. Now the enemy, soon the victor. American embassy officials had promised an orderly evacuation for their own people, the foreign press, and for all those Vietnamese who had worked for them and might be in danger. The plan was for a helicopter evacuation from the embassy grounds, and the signal was Bing Crosby singing White Christmas over Radio Saigon. But somebody forgot to play it, and the embassy was stormed. So people fought and clawed their way over that wall, and they did fight and they did claw. The hysteria was infectious. From midday to past midnight, a constant shuttle of naval helicopters from the American 7th Fleet airlifted out of that embassy more than 5,000 people. The ambassador went on the final helicopter from the platform above his office. He was the last American to leave Vietnam. Aboard the US carriers waiting off the coast in the South China Sea, helicopters were arriving that did not belong to any ship of the fleet. South Vietnamese pilots had commandeered them and had flown themselves and their families out from right under the noses of the Communist Army. They joined the ranks of refugees aboard, but there was no room for their machines on deck, and so millions of dollars worth of helicopters were simply pushed overboard. The North Vietnamese army entered Saigon just as they'd planned on May Day. Their journey had taken over 30 years, 10,000 days. And those of the world's press left behind in the city witnessed the triumphant arrival.
This is a historic moment, the arrival of the North Vietnamese Regular Army in Saigon, right in the middle of Saigon, just after 12 o'clock, just after noon. Here they are, pouring down the main avenue. Further up there is the American embassy. At this end of the avenue is the former presidential palace, which President Chu left just over a week ago, and from which General Min has today announced that he will unconditionally hand over to the new regime.
Their tanks had thundered down the length of Vietnam, all the way from Hanoi. Now they crossed Saigon's boulevards, and their foot-weary infantry plodded past the deserted military barracks. The people did not know whether they should cheer or weep, and they had yet to discover who was friend and who was foe. They had expected a bloodbath, but not a shot was fired that day and not a drop of blood spilt. The communist flag flew over a Saigon renamed. To honor the man whose prophecies had led them here and who had died before he saw them come true, they called it Ho Chi Minh City. South Vietnam, such a short-lived nation, was finally toppled. In Hanoi, they paraded the victors of the grimmest, longest war in modern history. The men and the weapons that had sent the mighty Americans packing. But they would soon discover they had little else to celebrate. They had won their war, but they were about to find that peace was much harder to manage. Post-war Vietnam continued to maintain the 5th largest army in the world, and yet it was bankrupt, dependent totally on its paymasters in Moscow. All Vietnam had to sell was the debris of its victory, the millions of tons of war junk the Americans had left behind, the remnants of their great military investment. Hanoi's first priority was to turn the scrap into dollars and buy the necessities of peacetime in a land fit for heroes. In the wretched monotony of their black world, these survivors of those battles must sometimes envy the dead. They returned blind from the front to inherit a 10-hour working day making pins and nails, and sometimes for variety, hooks. The government would like to call it rehabilitation, but in a country so poor, money and sympathy is scarce.
We attacked the Americans at Hue. I fired a rocket at a tank and blew it up. No one survived, I think. We kept our positions and I saw many die. But then a grenade exploded in my face and I never saw again.
They had to learn to make their own artificial wooden limbs once America cut off the supply of epoxy resin for the molds and Western governments refused any kind of aid. Some men were only boys when they lost their legs 20 years ago. They've only just begun walking on their wooden replacements. But many of Vietnam's post-war wounds are self-inflicted. The ploughman and his ox cannot keep pace with the population growth and the food that a peacetime Vietnam is demanding. And years of rigid Marxism have let this country go hungry. The bombs stopped falling long ago, but still, women irrigate the paddy fields with wicker baskets, as they have always done. And hundreds of thousands more spend their entire working days in water planting rice by hand. Their government stubbornly refuses change, and still there is famine, and still they believe that things will get better. Vietnam is today desperately poor, waiting for the rewards of more than a generation of wretchedness, waiting for the promises of peace to come true. Those who believed that life in communist Vietnam would get no better left by way of the South China Sea. The boat people began fleeing Vietnam in the last days of the war, and even so long into the peace, they are still prepared to risk their lives for a chance elsewhere.
Hello. Of course, I want to get to Australia or US or Canadian, you know, where I think I can make my life better. You know, I have reached my life for freedom. You know what I want.
Most bribed their way out of the seaports or the Mekong River, making for Hong Kong or the coasts of Thailand and Malaysia. But of the thousands who paid for a passage, only a fraction survived the storm, starvation, drowning, and piracy. The wrecks on so many beaches are tragic monuments to those who did not survive. But the strangest and the saddest of all goodbyes are in Saigon, and they are called the Amerasians. They are the children of American fathers, and the Vietnamese call them the Cong Lai, what the GIs left behind. Many are saying goodbye forever to Vietnam and their mothers, to be adopted by American strangers they have never seen and who have never seen them. The Cong Lai, who Vietnam does not want, innocent casualties of a war they never knew.
Museum curator, dead.
But now the Yanks are coming back, young American tourists who are discovering Vietnam for themselves. They are the children of ghosts returning, exploring the former battlegrounds they have only seen in Hollywood's war fantasies.
Leanne, whose tank is this? Whose was it? Vietnamese now. Well, I mean, was it American, or was it Arvin, or was it NVA, or?
American.
Was it one American? Did it get hit right here?
The Vietnamese hope it's the start of yet another dollar invasion as these young U.S. ambassadors make amends.
30, 40, 50, 60. You? Ah!
The tourists' favorite war relic is the Viet Cong tunnel complex at Cu Chi. It's one of the minor miracles of the war, 200 miles of interconnecting passageways built beneath what was then a vast American infantry base. The Viet Cong even stole strips of runway to support the roof. Hundreds of Viet Cong and their families lived and fought from here. A wall diagram shows the armories, the mess halls, the hospitals, clinics, the kitchens, and the lecture halls. Air was brought in through bamboo poles, and if it was too dangerous for men to move above, they simply swam through the river entrances. To try and find these tunnels, the Americans employed sniffer dogs and South Vietnamese troops that they called tunnel rats. Sometimes the tunnel rats were successful in discovering this network. They came underground face to face with the VC, and there were firefights 20 feet down. The human cost of the war is everywhere to be seen in a country that lost more than 1 million of its people. Even now, so long after the last shot was fired, new war cemeteries are opened as yet another battlefield gives up its dead. And at 9,000 miles away, the Americans who fought and were scarred on those same battlefields pay homage at their country's own memorial, where the dead are remembered in marble. 58,000 young men who did not live to see the end of the longest, saddest 10,000-day war that nobody won.
me to be out here. I have to think that what we're doing is right. I just wanted to know what a war was like. We are wearing him down right now, and I do believe we are winning.
Charlie, he always gonna manage to get some weapons from someone or somewhere, you know. They're gonna fight, you know, just gonna keep on fighting.
We probably haven't gotten a good return on the effort we put into Vietnam. I think truly the American man, you back him up against the wall, and I think that's what they've done over here. I don't think you'll find a tougher man anywhere.